Hi, welcome to the Bible Standard, where you are guaranteed in-depth Bible study and analysis. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comments area to have your say, and we'll do our best to reply.
Maybe there's a few questions out of this particular chapter and this particular story. Do you know what it says here in 2 Samuel 21 verse 1? Then there was a famine in the days of David 3 years. Now, we can't be sure when this episode occurred, because the word then can mean no more than and. But I think we do know something about the significance of the episode whenever it might have happened. Because we'll just come across to chapter 24 for a moment, 2 Samuel 24 verse 1, and just notice what the record says there. It says, "And again the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel." Again, did you notice that? And the margin says, see chapter 21 verse 1. So I think the implication is, you see, that the event of this chapter, chapter 21, was a previous exhibition of God's wrath against Israel. This famine didn't come about by chance. And based on the teaching of the law, we can be reasonably certain that it came about as a result of drought. In fact, if you come back to Deuteronomy chapter 11, the circumstances of what might have brought such a famine about are clearly outlined in the book of the law. And in fact, what the law says is perhaps helpful to our understanding of Rizpah's story. Deuteronomy chapter 11 says this in the 13th verse. "And it shall come to pass, if ye shall diligently hearken unto my commandments which I command you this day, to love Yahweh your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, that I will give you the rain of your land in his due season, the first rain and the latter rain, that thou mayest gather in thy corn and thy wine and thine oil. And I will send grass in thy fields for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be full. Take heed to yourselves, that your heart be not deceived, and ye turn aside and serve other gods and worship them, and then Yahweh's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven, that there be no rain, and that the land yield not her fruit, lest ye perish quickly from off the good land which Yahweh giveth you." So if rain was the symbol of God's approval, verse 14, then the lack of rain was the symbol of God's disapproval, verse 17. Now, you'll know, of course, that the rains of verse 14 came in the opposite order. The latter rains of Abib were the soft spring showers that came at the start of the harvest season. They helped to swell the grain before the harvest began. But at the very end of harvest came what was called the former rains in Ephanim, the heavy autumn downpours that softened the soil to sow the crops for the year to come. But there'd been no latter or former rains now for the last 3 years, long enough for David to interpret it as a judgment from God and to seek his counsel. So coming back to the 2nd of Samuel and chapter 21, we read these words, therefore. What did David do? Well, it says he inquired of Yahweh, which probably means, incidentally, that he went to the priest and sought for the counsel of God by means of Urim and Thummim. And the divine answer came back as follows. Yahweh answered, "It is for Saul and his house of blood, because he slew the Gibeonites." The New International Version says it's on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. In other words, the house or the family upon which rested the guilt of shedding innocent blood. So the answer that comes back to David was, in effect, that there was an unfinished matter of national sin that God held Israel accountable for. And that sin was the unwarranted slaughter of the Gibeonites by Saul, whose motives, incidentally, in doing so were less than honourable. So verse 2 says, "And the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them." And do you notice that the rest of the verse, right to the end, is now in explanatory parenthesis? There's brackets. But the force of the bracketed sections, well, let's just read it. "Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the children of Israel had sworn unto them, and yet for all of that Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. So the crucial part of this story is that the children of Israel had sworn to their Gibeonites that their lives would be preserved. Now, come back again to the record of that, because it's again helpful. In Joshua chapter 9, and you'll all know this episode of how the Gibeonites tricked Joshua and the men of Israel into making a covenant with them. But there were some mistakes along the way, weren't there, that Israel made. And this is what we're told in Joshua chapter 9, reading from verse 14. It says, "And the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of Yahweh, and Joshua made peace with them and made a league with them to let them live. And the princes of the congregation swear unto them." And having done that, verse 17 says that they journeyed and came to their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Kephirah and Beeroth and Kiriath Jearim. And the children of Israel smote them not, because the princes of the congregation had sworn unto them by Yahweh Elohim of Israel. And all the congregation murmured against the princes, but all the princes said, "Well, we can't do anything about it. We've sworn unto them by the name of our God, therefore we may not touch them." So they said, well, what we should do is make them hewers of wood and drawers of water, verse 21, unto all the congregation. Let's put them into servitude. Let's render them under subjection. But Joshua had an even better idea. He said, verse 23, "Now therefore," he said, "ye are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen, and hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." And one of the reasons why the Gibeonites should have been slain in the first instance was because the nations of the Canaanites would have led Israel astray to the worship of other gods. Joshua said, "Your lives are preserved, but you will be taken to serve in the temple of God, the God of Israel. You'll be hewers of wood and drawers of water for the service of the worship of the God of Israel, so that you might never lead this nation astray in other matters of false worship." Well, they were drawers of water for the sanctuary, but now the waters ceased, says the 2nd of Samuel 21. It is because of the Gibeonites. So Saul's action was in violation of that covenant promise that had been made to the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua chapter 9. And so as David comes to ask the Gibeonites what might be done, what should be done in this matter, their answer comes back as follows. We're not told for how long the Gibeonites might have cried to God for retribution in the 2nd of Samuel 21. But perhaps in a sense, the longer the time, the more significant it is, because it teaches us that God never forgets what's been done and that he will finally hold all sins accountable. So back in the 2nd of Samuel 21 and verse 3, the record says, "Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you, and wherewith shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of Yahweh?" So David recognized, yes, it is. It's a matter of national sin, and it's a matter of sin that needs atonement before God's judgment could be removed. So here comes the answer of the Gibeonites. And I want you to ask yourself this question. Do you think that their spirit was good or bad? What thinkest thou? And see what they say in reply to David's question, verse 4. "And the Gibeonites said unto him, We will have no silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house." Now, what do you think they meant by that? Well, part of the lesson, obviously, is that financial compensation cannot atone for wrongdoing. We can't buy our way out of sin. Now, they could have made a lot of money, the Gibeonites, because actually it was common practice with other nations of paying financial reparations for wrongful death. So the Gibeonites could have said, well, we'd like a whole lot of cash, thanks. But their reasoning, I think, was thoroughly scriptural. So they go on to say not only that we'll have no silver nor gold of Saul nor of his house, neither, they say in the balance of the verse, neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. Now, the Revised Standard Version says neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. Now that's slightly different, isn't it? In other words, what they were saying was that as a subject nation, they had no authority to execute the judicial sentence of death upon any man in Israel. But what was the implication of what they said? It doesn't pertain to us to do such a thing, O king. But they obviously believed that that's what should happen, but that they had no jurisdiction to act in such a matter. And so David says at the end of the verse, he said, "What ye shall say, that will I do for you." Now, David, could have ridden roughshod over this minority group, who, after all, were only bond slaves to the nation. But he said, didn't he, in effect, all right, what do you want me to do? And the spirit of the king was that he recognized the direction of their request, and he was prepared to act upon it in finding the atonement that the nation so desperately needed. And so verse 5 says, and they answered the king, "The man that consumed us and that devised against us that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coasts of Israel." You see, if there was to be any restitution, it had to come from the family that had committed the sin. And this sin came from the household of Saul. And from the household of Saul alone could the answer come in making amends. And so they say in verse 6, "Let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us." Now, there weren't 7 of Saul's sons alive, but there were descendants of Saul. And you'll know that the term son, at least in Hebrew, can embrace several generations in either direction. Let 7 descendants of Saul be granted unto us. So 7 to signify a complete atoning sacrifice in expiation for the sin that had been committed. So Saul's family were to bear complete responsibility for this matter. But you notice this, they prize. They said in the balance of that verse 6, "We will hang them up unto Yahweh in Gibeah of Saul." Now, incidentally, I don't think the record means that they were to be impaled alive upon stakes. They would be judicially executed, and then they would be placarded before God. Now, do you know what's interesting about that request of the Gibeonites? Is that it is exactly in accordance with what the law of Moses said. Come back to Numbers chapter 35 and see just how closely the Gibeonites were in fact following the teaching of Moses. This was not an act of reprisal on their part. They read the law. They understood the law. Bondsmen that they might be, but they'd entered into the spiritual teaching of the house of Israel whom they served. Now, you notice this in Numbers 35. It says this in verse 29. "So these things shall be for a statute of judgment unto you throughout your generations in all your dwellings. Whoso killeth any person, the murderer shall be put to death by the mouth of witnesses. But one witness shall not testify against any person to cause him to die. Moreover, ye shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer, which is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death." So this is why the Gibeonites said, "We will have no silver nor gold of Saul." They would accept no offer of compensation because the law said, "Ye shall take no satisfaction for the life of the murderer." So they were spiritually minded. And once slain, the dead bodies were going to be crucified or lifted up before the face of Yahweh as a public exhibition that that sacrifice had taken place, that it might turn away the wrath of God from the nation. This is not the spirit of revenge on the part of the Gibeonites. This was their spiritual response to the requirements of God himself. And this, remember, to turn away judgments that lay on all Israel. Oh, and where would they hang them? Come back to the 2nd of Samuel chapter 21. Where would they hang them? We'll hang them up in Gibeah of Saul, the home and the capital of the man who'd brought the wrath of God upon the land through his crime, the very place where the murderer had lived. And yet for all of that, they said, "He is Saul whom Yahweh did choose. So you see their respect for the office of the king. But there's a lesson here, isn't there, brothers and sisters? Even the chosen of God are not exempt from upholding his covenants. In fact, they hold the greatest duty of responsibility. They of all people are not above obeying the commandments of God. And Saul's actions, despite his zeal, were forbidden by the law. In fact, this is really Exodus 21, verse 12. He that smiteth a man so that he die, he shall be surely put to death. That's what the Gibeonites are saying. And so David says, 2 Samuel 21, verse 6, at the end of the verse, and the king said, I will give them. So David's answer, don't you think, showed his understanding of the spirit of the Gibeonites? And his response wasn't motivated by a desire to rid himself of potential rivals from Saul's house. It was the wise decision of a king acting on the information given to him after inquiring of God. I will give them. In the Hebrew, ani eten. It's a very short, brief, terse phrase. There was no joy to David in this action. But it was consistent with the action of Moses at another crisis of national sin, was it not? Because do you remember these words? Numbers 25, verses 3 and 4. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel. And Yahweh said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before Yahweh against the sun, that the fierce anger of Yahweh may be turned away from Israel. Oh yes, what the Gibeonites had asked for had already been done by Moses on an earlier occasion. But most of all, David's response was based upon the very passage used by the Gibeonites in making their request. Hold your hand in 2 Samuel, and just come back again to Numbers 35 and the verse that follows on after the one we read. Because in Numbers 35, in the matter of the death of a murderer, the law went on to say this. We read verse 31, ye shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer. He which is guilty of death, he shall be surely put to death. And then it goes on to say this, verse 33, so ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood, it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. Now, isn't that exactly the situation in the 2nd of Samuel 21? The land cannot be cleansed of the blood of the Gibeonites who've been slain by Saul, other than by the blood of the slayer himself. And David understood that the blood guilt that rested upon the land could only be cleansed by the blood of the offender. And clearly God himself, by means of the famine, had already told the nation that this sin had not yet been atoned for. And so he says to the Gibeonites, I will give them. But that led to David having a problem. Who might he choose to meet that request? Let 7 descendants of Saul be given to us, and we'll hang them up before Yahweh in Gibeah of Saul. Well, you see what it says? The record's interesting. It says in 2 Samuel 21, verse 7, that having decided that he would do this very thing, it says, but the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of Yahweh's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. Now, this is a very interesting verse because it tells us how easy it is for motives to be wrongly assessed. You see, it would be easy for people to say, he spared Mephibosheth because of favoritism. Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan, was a good friend of David, so he spared one of the most obvious candidates amongst the 7 men. Favoritism by the king. But actually, he wasn't spared for that reason at all, was he? But come back to the 1st of Samuel chapter 20. He was spared for this reason. And the record says so here, because of Yahweh's oath. But here it is now, the 1st of Samuel chapter 20. Here's the details of that oath that had been made between David and Jonathan. And the record says in 1st of Samuel 20, verse 14, that Jonathan says to David, And thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of Yahweh, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when Yahweh hath cut off the enemies of David, everyone from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let Yahweh even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And David and Jonathan had entered into covenant promise that David would spare the household of Jonathan even after Jonathan was dead. So how could he take Mephibosheth as one of the seven and slay him? This whole crisis in chapter 21 of 2 Samuel had arisen because Saul had violated a covenant oath which had been made. How could David, in making atonement for that break, promptly break a covenant that he himself had made? He couldn't do that. He had to honor his own promises. And so he spared Mephibosheth, not because of personal bias, but because of faithfulness to his own covenant obligations. Well, I think David was quite spiritually minded, don't you think? And now see what it says in terms of who he did choose back in 2 Samuel 21, verse 8. But the king took the two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, whom she bare unto Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, clearly a different Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. And when we first read this 8th verse, it might seem that the selection is somewhat capricious. Well, there's 2 over there, and there's a handful over there. I'll make up 7 from these. And it seems as if it's just maybe random. But as we reflect upon this story, we realize that David's choice was made very, very carefully indeed. Now think about it. The first of Saul's 3 sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchi-Shua, had all died with him in the battle of Gilboa. We're told that in the 1 Samuel 31, verse 2. So the first 3 are already dead. But there was a 4th son, wasn't there? Ishbosheth. But he was slain by 2 men of Beeroth, incidentally a Gibeonite city, and possibly in sympathy for Saul's slaying of the Gibeonites. We're told that in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. So now Ishbosheth is dead. 4 sons of Saul are already dead. And there's only 2 other sons that we know about who might be classed as immediate descendants of Saul. And they are Armoni and Mephibosheth, the sons of Rizpah, the only other known surviving sons of Saul. So he took those. And, says the record, the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai. Now, there's a problem with the text here, because we're only told of 2 daughters of Saul, Merab and Michal. And the word brought up here in that verse does mean to bear children. But Michal wasn't married to Adriel. Merab, her sister, was. So they've got to be Merab's children, Merab's sons. In fact, they can't be the children of Michal, can they? Saul's younger daughter. Because she was condemned, do you remember, to be childless until the day of her death. 2 Samuel 6, verse 23, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. So whoever these boys are, these 5 men, they've got to be Merab's sons in the 2nd of Samuel 21, verse 8. And these 7 men are most probably the closest living male descendants of Saul. David made the best choice he could. And I think there's something more in David's choice based on his understanding of Scripture. You see, the law said this, Deuteronomy 24, verse 16, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. So how do we reconcile the singling out of these 7 men for execution with the teaching of the law in Deuteronomy 24, verse 16? I think the answer lies in the words of verse 1. Read them again carefully. Why did this famine come? It is for Saul and his house of blood. You see, Saul did not act alone in this massacre, and these 7 men may well have been part of Saul's troop. It was a family-led initiative, and these 7 of Saul's relatives were probably complicit in Saul's war against the Gibeonites. In fact, notice it again in verse 4. We'll have no silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house. Nothing happens at random in the purpose of God. And given David's spirit of integrity and his sense of justice, I think it's logical for us to conclude that those who were offered had all taken part in the sin. They were also covenant breakers. There was no injustice here. Verse 9 says, he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them in the hill before Yahweh, and they fell all 7 together, were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days in the beginning of barley harvest. So the Gibeonites did exactly as they'd said. The 7 men were first put to death, and then they were hung up before Yahweh in the high place of Gibeon. And the record would stress that all 7 fell together, showing that there was but one atoning sacrifice, but made up of these 7 individuals. And now, brothers and sisters, young people, at last, the heroine of our story arrives. After that lengthy but necessary introduction, now Rizpah turns up on the scene in the 1st to 2nd of Samuel 21 and verse 10. And the record says, and Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it for her upon the rock. Now, sackcloth was associated with mourning for the dead. We're told that in Genesis 37 and verse 34, and again in 2nd of Samuel 3, verse 31. But it was also connected with the public expression of those who repented before God. Used that way in the 1st of Kings 21, verse 27, and Numbers 9, verse 1. So 2 ideas with sackcloth: mourning for the dead, repenting for sin. And I think that Rizpah probably had both ideas in mind. But do you notice that the record was clear what the sackcloth was used for? It wasn't there for the dead bodies. It says she spread it for herself upon the rock. Now, that word spread means to stretch out, and it's used in the context of pitching a tent. And I think that's what she did. She had a robe of sackcloth. She probably put it on a pole, and she used her outer robe of mourning as a makeshift tabernacle. And I think she did that because at this moment of time, when she arrived with that sackcloth, she didn't know how long she'd be there for. But she would do this thing, says the record, verse 10. She suffered neither the beasts of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. Rizpah protected the bodies from the attack of either bird or beast, because it was considered a matter of disgrace for a body to be mutilated in this way. In fact, you might remember the words of David when he spoke to Goliath. In the 1st of Samuel 17 and verse 46, he said to Goliath, I will take thine head from thee, and I'll give the carcasses of the hosts of the Philistine this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And Rizpah did not want to see that shame brought upon her boys. Can you imagine how torn this woman must have been? On the one side, as a mother, she couldn't bear to see the bodies of her sons lifted up in death. And on the other side, she couldn't bear to be away from them as she sought to protect them from mutilation. She was innocent in the matter herself. She was simply a grieving mother caught up in a set of circumstances over which she had no control. But she did the only thing she could. She came in all her suffering and all her grief, and she stayed beside that sacrifice. But that little tent of sackcloth stretched on the top of Gibeah's hill showed that this was a commitment for a period of time that even she herself did not at this stage know. And that fact, I think, leads to the conclusion that there was more to Rizpah's watching over the bodies than first might be thought. So how long did she keep her vigil? Well, we're told, aren't we, in the record? The record says expressly in verse 10 that she was there from the beginning of harvest, verse 9, till water dropped out of them from heaven, verse 9 and 10. So her vigil began in the month of Abib, at the beginning of harvest. And then it passed to Ziv, which was the wheat harvest, and then to Sivan, when the heat increased and the early vintage was taken, and then to Tammuz, which was the grape harvest, and then to Av, which was the hottest month of the year, and then to Elul, when the dates and the figs and the olives were gathered, and finally into Ethanim, when the autumn rains fell at the very end of harvest. Brothers and sisters, she guarded these bodies for 6 months. For 6 months. She chased away the birds, and for 6 months she frightened away the beasts. And she kept her watch through heat and cold, through night and day. She must have been exhausted. Not a word, not a sound. Just her silent, lonely, amazing vigil of devotion wrapped in the grief of her own desolation. Now, don't you think that if Rizpah's vigil was purely an act of motherly devotion, she would have long since left the scene? But there was something about what she did and why she did it that went beyond her mother's grief and saw beyond her son's demise. Now, here's something strange out of the book of the law. You'll know these verses, but just think about this in the context of this story. Deuteronomy 21 said in verses 22 and 23, if a man have committed a sin worthy of death and he be put to death and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which Yahweh thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. But these bodies were left hanging on public display for 6 months. Now, why? And the answer is because on this occasion, the land was already defiled by the shedding of blood by Saul's house, Numbers 35. And it could only be cleansed by the blood of the atoning sacrifice. And that's exactly what these 7 boys were about. These 7 sons of Saul, these 7 bodies were a sacrifice of atonement, which continued to be placarded until the signal came from God himself that his forgiveness had been extended. And until God sent that sign, those bodies would remain lifted up before him, and Rizpah would continue to guard them. Notice, not just the bodies of her 2 boys, but the bodies of all 7 men. You see, this was not just a vigil kept as a mother. There was something deeper and more profound in Rizpah's spirit. And this is really the question of our study. Why really did Rizpah keep her vigil? What was she really doing? And I think, brothers and sisters, we must come to the conclusion that she'd gone beyond her personal grief to realize that her sons were but part of a sacrifice for national sin, and she guarded the bodies of all the sacrificial victims so that they would not be desecrated until God accept the sacrifice. And isn't this precisely what Abraham had done on an earlier occasion? Genesis 15, verses 10 and 11. And Abram took unto him all these and divided them in the midst and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not. And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. Isn't that exactly what Rizpah's doing here? In all her grief, she knew that the nation depended on this offering and that it was the means by which salvation would come. So she waited. Till when? She waited, says the record, verse 10, until the waters dropped. Now, how did she know that was the sign? Because, brothers and sisters, the famine had begun when the rain had stopped. So she waited until, as the New King James Version says, until the late rains poured upon them from heaven. And when the rain fell and fell and fell, mingling with her tears, Rizpah knew that Yahweh had accepted the sacrifice and that now her vigil could cease. She would need her sackcloth tent no more. The water pouring out of heaven was God's answer that the sacrifice had been accepted and that atonement had been made. And verse 11 says, and it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, the concubine of Saul, had done. So the king heard. With that flash of insight, so typical of David, his mind leapt to the full significance of what Rizpah had done and why. And he knew that there was a further work to complete hers, which she could not expedite, but he could. And so David immediately decided that that's what he would do, in honor of what Rizpah had done on this occasion. And so it tells us in verse 12 this: David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, which had stolen them from the street of Beth-shan, where the Philistines had hanged them when the Philistines had slain Saul in Mount Gilboa. So David takes the bones of Saul, and although it doesn't mention them, it clearly would be the bones of the three boys who fell with him on that day, the bones of all of them. And then it goes on to say, verse 13, and he brought up from thence the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan's son, and they also gathered the bones of them that were hanged. And that reference, we believe, at the end of that verse is to the 7 men who were hanged in verse 9. The ones hanged in this chapter. So what David did in effect was to bind Saul and all his house into both the matter of the sin and the atonement that had been wrought. So why did he gather the bones? Well, verse 14 says that he took all of the bones and he took them to the country of Benjamin and Zelah, and he buried them in the sepulchre of Kish his father, and they performed all that the king commanded. And so the burial now of the whole clan in the family sepulchre closed the account of this sacrifice for sin. And not only did David respond to Rizpah's extraordinary devotion by allowing her sons the dignity of a proper family burial, but he also did something else because, well, again, hold your hand in 2 Samuel, but come back to the 1st of Samuel 24. Don't you think David would have thought about this as well at this moment in terms of what he did? 1st of Samuel 24, verse 20 says, Saul, speaking to David, says, and now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Swear now, therefore, unto me by Yahweh, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men gat them up into the hold, and David fulfilled that oath to Saul himself, right here in the 2nd of Samuel 21, by gathering the bones of all the family and burying them where? Why, in the sepulchre of Kish his father, so that Saul's name might not be destroyed out of his father's house. Oh, don't you think that was an honourable thing for David to do? Absolutely honourable on this occasion. And they performed, says the record, all that the king commanded. So coming back to 2 Samuel now, verse 21, the record says, and after that, God was entreated for the land. I think there's something wonderful about this story because, you see, David acted with integrity in this episode. He upheld Yahweh's principles. He satisfied the request of the Gibeonites. He offered a final salute to Jonathan. He respected his vow to Saul, and he saluted the vigil of Rizpah and provided her with the closure she needed. He was a good man, was David. But don't you think also Rizpah was a marvelous woman in this story in terms of her activities and her thinking? And so also, for that matter, with the Gibeonites. Everybody acted with integrity in this story, no matter how tragic it was. And that little phrase, after that, is the culmination of all that Rizpah did in honouring Yahweh's sacrifice and all that David did in honouring Rizpah's devotion. And so we come to the conclusion of the matter, and despite its tragedy and its sorrow, we feel satisfied that the end was right. And yet how often do we reach the end of such a story and wonder if there's another level, a deeper layer hidden beneath the surface? See, all Scripture has the watermark of God's Son stamped on every page. Christ's always there, isn't he? And he's in this story as well. Everything's got significance when we suddenly see it in the light of the work of our Lord Jesus Christ. Take this, the matter of the mode of death. We're told in verse 6, we will hang them up unto Yahweh. So their sacrifice was to be a matter of public display. But that's what happened to Christ, wasn't it? Because of Christ it says in John 12, verses 32 and 33, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This he said, signifying what death he should die. And Galatians 3 verse 1 says, reading from the New American Bible, before whose eyes Jesus was publicly portrayed as crucified. So the sacrifice of Christ, like that of the 2nd of Samuel 21, was a matter of public display. He was placarded among them. And as with the mode of death, so with the purpose of death. 2 Samuel 21 verse 6 said, let 7 men of his sons be delivered to us. So this was a representative offering which had to be of the same flesh as that which had sinned. But wasn't that one of the most important aspects of our Lord's sacrifice? Is that he had to share the nature of those he came to redeem. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, does it not? For he has made him to be sin for us who knew no sin. 1 Peter 3 verse 2 verse 24 says, who his own self bare our sins in his own body to the tree, that we being dead to sins should live unto righteousness. So the purpose of death was the same, atonement through a representative offering. And what about the place of death, for that matter? Because the 2nd of Samuel 21 verse 9 says, they hanged them in the hill before Yahweh. And that phrase is an allusion to the fact that they were hung up in Gibeah, verse 6, because the word Gibeah means hill. But actually the word hill, verse 9, isn't the word Gibeah. It's not the word Gibah, which is where the root word comes from. It's actually the word more commonly translated mount in the Old Testament. It's the word ha. But that's where the Lord would be crucified, wasn't it? Genesis 22 verses 13 and 14, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up, and Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, as it is said, this day in the mount of Yahweh it shall be seen. What shall be seen? The final perfect sacrifice. And the Lord was taken to Golgotha, which sat on the northern ridge of Mount Moriah, and in that mount the salvation of God was finally seen. And just as the sacrifice of 2 Samuel 21 had to take place in the city of Saul, who broke the covenant, so the Lord was sacrificed in the royal city of the covenant breakers, and in that place he was lifted up on the mount before Yahweh. Well, when did this sacrifice in the 2nd of Samuel 21 occur? Well, aren't we told in verse 9, they fell all 7 together, were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of barley harvest. See, at the time of Passover, the first fruit sheaf that was offered on the morrow after the Sabbath, that sheaf was always barley, because the barley ripened first, marked the very beginning of the harvest season. And that detail is marked in the New Testament, is it not? John 6, verse 4, verse 9, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. And Andrew said, there's a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves. So the Lord was offered at Passover at exactly the same time as the sacrifice of the 2nd of Samuel, chapter 21. Remarkable. And what was the result of this death? Well, verse 14 told us, after that, God was entreated for the land. And when the sacrifice was accomplished, the return of God's favour was marked by the pouring out of the autumn rains and the lifting of the famine. But behind that, it also signified that Yahweh had heard the prayers of the king and the nation, and that through this peace, the peace that was restored, it wasn't just restored to Israel, it was also restored to the Gibeonites, and there was peace now again between Israel and the Gentile Gibeonites that were in relationship with them. But isn't that what the Lord's work has done? Ephesians 2 says in verses 14 to 18, "For he is our peace, who hath made both one, that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off, the Gentiles, and to them which were nigh, the Jews. For through him we both have access by one Spirit into the Father." And the sacrifice of Christ was instrumental in bringing about the reconciliation of Jew and Gentile, just as the sacrifice of these 7 brought about the reconciliation of the Israelites and the Gibeonites. And verse 10 of this chapter, 2 Samuel 21, shows us that Rizpah was there as a faithful witness to that sacrifice, despite her personal grief and her sorrow. So I think Rizpah understood that her sons were caught up in a drama that was larger than all of them. Whole nations stood in need of atonement, which their sacrifice would bring. And when we consider the agony of Rizpah, our minds, don't you think our minds flash forward? Because the spirit of Rizpah would be seen in the experience of Mary of Nazareth. Hadn't someone said to Mary these words, "This child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against. Yea, a sword shall pierce thine own soul also." And Mary was to know the same stabbing sorrow that could pierce the heart, a sorrow that culminated in the crucifixion of her own son. In fact, John 19, verse 25 tells us, does it not? "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and Mary, like Rizpah, had to grapple with the fact that the offering of her son stood related to higher things. She had to see beyond her own grief to the knowledge that her son's sacrifice was to be the means of salvation to Jew and Gentile, that in him she beheld the Lamb of God that would take away the sin of the world. And despite her sorrow, she was there. Mary was there, standing by the Lord at the foot of his cross. She came in her grief to gaze upon the body of her son and to be a witness of his death. And you know, I think there's a lesson for us. Well, there's obviously a lot of lessons, but there's a particular lesson for us in this story I found very helpful. Because you see, I think what Rizpah teaches us is the need to see beyond our own sorrow and our own grief in the immediate circumstances of life that come upon us, and to believe that the Father's greater power is always at work, and that his providential control is always in operation. And what Rizpah does is she helps us to believe in the possibility, even at the worst moments in our life, brothers and sisters, when we wonder why it's all happening and why it's come upon us in the way that it has, that there will be a divine perspective which we've not yet seen, but we trust that one day we shall, in his good mercy, see it by his grace. We believe in that. Rizpah had to believe in that. Mary had to believe in that. And so do we, brothers and sisters, that the Father's hand is at work, even in our darkest moments, that we can trust there is some purpose in the Father's almighty thinking that must bring us through that dark moment and back out into the brightness of the light. And perhaps in this matter, Rizpah becomes not just a type of Mary of Nazareth, but of the woman community of the saints, because isn't this our job as the members of the community, to maintain a vigil over the sacrificial body of Christ, to guard its meaning, to guard the symbol of the death of our Lord, the sacrificial death, to protect it by our own vows of desiccation, to watch over his atoning work until the purpose of our God shall be fulfilled. And the rain of blessing pours down out of heaven upon us all. We feel humbled, don't we, by such an amazing woman and what she endured in faithfulness before her God, and that in the mercy of the Father, her story was recorded, that we might know it all. Now, let me read you the words of a hymn, brothers and sisters, by way of conclusion. And as I read these words, written, by the way, by Brother L.G. Sargent, a beloved hymn, I want you to see if you can capture the pathos and the cry of Rizpah in these words. This is what our brother wrote on the matter of the sacrifice of Christ. Was it for me thy flesh was wounded sore, thy body lifted high on the cross of shame? Was it for me the King of glory bore so meek the scourge and ruthless men's defame? Was there no way for any man to live but thou must die? No joy but through thy grief? Is sin so dark that God cannot forgive save through thy sacrifice and our belief? Lord, let me learn thy sorrow, mark thy pain, but no more heedless through the world I roam, but come to take the pardon thou didst gain, and find within thy fold eternal home.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.